This is a bit of a hodgepodge of some things that kind of an introduction of who I am and the things that make, that kind of move me and when I come in every day and try to do something special. And at the same time, I want to bring some things that are going on in my world right now. Um, for those that don't know, I've been in information security for a little over 20 years. I think we're about to 24 professional years in it. I spend a ton of my time doing cutting edge research around network forensics as well as kind of corner case edge application of intelligence from those things. Spent a bunch of time with news agencies these days. Um, Last evening was pretty exciting. I was on NBC News to discuss how geofencing was used to vacate two murder charges against an individual, and then that same technology and that same amount of time being used to find the actual killer of a man down here in the southeast that was accused of killing his parents. But we've used the technology to some of the things that we built here to prevent active shooter situations, mass casualty events, um, child exploitation, child endangerment, some pretty interesting stuff that we've been able to do over the past few years. Um, some of the things that make me the most happy that I've been able to do, especially here recently, is we do have a patent pending on our platform for physical threat detection using digital markers. Effectively, and it's not a kind of a feasibility patent or one that's built around the concept of something. This is something that is actually running and is used with subscribers around the world right now. And it's been great. We've used it 2017, 2018, 2019 to prevent mass casualty events. I'm having a hard time talking today. Um, and it's super meaningful work that we've been doing. In 2020, we changed the focus on the intelligence and the modeling that we're doing to go after COVID-19 focused cyber criminals. And as it stands right now, we're analyzing about 3 million artifacts a minute from around the world. And we're using that to prevent phishing attacks. We're working with healthcare agencies to prevent breaches or to let them know that we're seeing malicious activity that's taking place. Basically, the goal of the platform in the first two examples is preservation of life. Um, I'm very happy that working with the Meta Center and UC Berkeley that I was able to build a web application that was used around the world for restorative justice. And effectively, it was a mobile web app that could be pulled up on satellite phones and shared from village to village to village, largely by the bicycle ladies that are in India that will go to parts of the country where they don't have active internet presence or connectivity of any sort. Um, and then very important to me as it applies to what we're doing here is I developed and worked to build a program that combated illiteracy in North Georgia and up here where there's a great amount of individuals that are below the poverty line. They've got entire generations, through a family, multi-generation that never, made it out of elementary school or middle school. So we built a platform called Launchpads for Literacy, where we worked with Napa, Advanced Auto Stores, AutoZone to go and pull the machines that they weren't using anymore and rebuild them, refit them, and ship them out in the homes so that the adults could learn how to read along with their children. Also got to hack a train once, which was really, really fun. When I was younger, being from my background and my family, not being just above the poverty line, I always wanted a train set, and we couldn't afford one. So the neat thing about growing up is that you can chase some dreams, and instead of getting a train set, I actually just was able to take over a real one. And one of the highlights of my career by far. But the reason that we're here, right, um, is that the world is changing. And, when I look at it, from where we were just a handful of years ago to today, it's been a very kind of stark reality that we've had to learn. which essentially is that, the lifestyle that we all thought we were going to have is currently out of stock. We're looking at COVID impacting everything that we do, from being able to go outside to going to restaurants to going on a date, or how you're teaching. And the whole world's kind of changing in a way that I don't think many of us were here for, Spanish flu and some of the other things that were kind of landscape changers. But things I want to bring up today is how has that impacted, cybersecurity? How's that impacted businesses? And what can we do about it? The challenges that we saw right at the beginning of the year when companies were trying to handle this is they were not prepared for such a large percentage of their workforce to go remote. On average, most businesses are capable of around 2 to 6, maybe 7% of their workforce being ready to go telecommute. And then we ended up flipping that completely on its head and turned it to, an average of 93 to 97% of the workforce being entirely remote. So you don't see, we didn't see that infrastructure of VPN solutions that were properly deployed. We saw internal operations that ended up being turned over to external holding. So, entire HR and finance departments that were internal being slashed and then forced into other externally held environments to do that work. And some of this was, revenue driven, some of this was situationally driven, but it made pretty significant changes. Additionally, we're seeing, employee-owned devices and employee-owned solutions being used in the organization, which have very, very little control. Most companies didn't have a policy around how they were going to handle, managed device security, or how they were going to handle data as it transferred between their corporate-owned devices and personal devices. And then as we've seen, we're all, many of us are all in one house, with our spouses and with our children, which kind of brings some privacy issues into place and some intellectual property issues in place, because not everyone that's in the home that's around the devices are potentially using the same computers signed, intellectual, rights and privacy, agreements and things of those nature. So what we've really learned is that where companies were focused on protecting devices and servers and things like that, it doesn't really work anymore. We sort of had this belief, going into previous years that most of our infrastructure lived behind a firewall, and that's no longer the case. So if you're focusing on securing the device, you'll fail. It's become a shift to how do we focus, our interests and our efforts on protecting the data, no matter where that data lives. Because we don't really know, if it's on a laptop that the employee owns, if now it's on their phones, so things have changed. Something else that has changed is, prior to COVID, we were seeing roughly a third of what you're seeing here. We were seeing 220, we're seeing 220,000 critical events, where prior to it, we were seeing closer to about 60 to 70,000. So it hasn't been a linear increase. It's been quite an exponential increase. And then additionally, we're seeing more on our threat intelligence network. So as we were seeing, roughly around 4,000 attacks on VNC and remote desktop solutions, we're seeing closer to 500,000. And this is over the course of 24 hours. And the attackers are pretty interesting, where we used to see the majority of the things coming out of China, and the attacks being primarily in United States. Now we're seeing more attacks taking place in third world countries. Like our Africa sensor is through the roof. And the reason why we're seeing that shift is because attackers are focusing on a low-hanging fruit. And unfortunately, many of the nations that are in Africa do not have the same resources that you're going to see in your world superpowers. So we're seeing almost 500,000 attacks against remote desktop options that are available coming out of Africa. So here's where things get weird, right? You know, before COVID, we were sending emails amongst ourselves, and maybe we were just walking down the hallway and stepping into a conference room. And I know it's been, you know, 6-7 months, but to me, that feels like a lifetime ago. You know, that I just got up from my desk and walked down the hallway and went into a conference room or put my head in someone's office and just ask a question. You know, now we're living on Zoom, and we're living in Slack and Teams, and you know, we're emailing stuff back and forth, and sometimes we can't get in our corporate email. So when we get in there, we're emailing things to our personal email. And then when we respond to that email from our personal email, the entire chain of communication is forever changed, you know, as far as that communication is involved, because now business is being conducted from a personal email account, and it's being replied back and forth. And on top of that, that third-party account that an employee is using that they're forwarding an email to may be part of the data breach. So now we don't know who all has access to it. We also didn't have, and I'm not sure that this has really been addressed in a great way, but teleworking policies. Like, how do you expect your employees to behave, and how do you expect them to perform when they're not coming to the office anymore? And there's no sort of direct interaction from day to day. Have you sort of defined what the expectation is so that you can make sure that they know what the expectation is? Because it's really hard to hold people to an expectation that's never been defined. And unfortunately, you know, work from home scenarios have increased all of the credential reuse and phishing attacks. Again, these are not gradual increases; these are exponential increases, and it's a little bit scary and sometimes even a bit terrifying where things are going. So here's the methodologies that we're seeing today that are attacked, that are being leveraged against organizations and people. Phishing credential reuse through the roof. Malware only getting harder. Lots of configuration mistakes on networks. You know, for instance, you know, if you're going to go 96% remote workforce, but you don't have a VPN solution, most organizations' response to that has been to turn their networks inside out like a sock. So what was currently housed inside, flipped inside out. You know, servers connected directly to the internet, remote desktop solutions connected directly to the internet, forwarded emails, and then not identities being stolen as we used to know them, but identities really being stolen. And the definition being, if someone took your credit card or they used your social security number, your identity hasn't actually been stolen. Your identity has been borrowed, you know, but those are things that you can replace, or you can have reissued. Stealing biometrics, thumbprints, retinal scans. These things are not things that you can just recreate. And there's some kind of worse ones as we go along, but let's get into some use cases real quick. So credentials, this is an actual case that we worked. Credentials were leaked by COVID-related breaches. Again, servers being connected directly to the internet, not being patched. Data was dumped, and then sensitive information was dumped into online marketplaces. This stuff was being leaked. It was also being phished. But the problem that we found is that now greater than 95% of our engagements don't require us to actually breach a server for us to get in. Most of the credentials have already been leaked. And remember, you know, as someone preventing a breach, you have to get it right all the time. Someone that's actually performing a breach, we only need to get it right once. So if we have one good set of credentials that gives us remote access, almost, I want to say every time, but there's been one situation in 4 years where we couldn't elevate and just take the rest of the credentials and systems inside an organization. Kind of put it in perspective, 445.6 million records breached in 2018, 7.9 billion records between 2019 and now into 2020. That's not a small growth. And a lot of these records, individuals don't know that it's happened yet because the news release hasn't come out. But this is what these look like, when you're being phished. More than 75,000, infected COVID-19 cases. Click on this link so that you can see what's going on in your neighborhood and what you need to do to protect your family. Who doesn't want to click on that link? 2 days ago, I had a very, very close friend, family member, that he found out just 2 months ago that he had cancer. Unfortunately, 2 days ago, that escalated very quickly, and then his health declined, and then the COVID impacts came in. And 2 days ago, he was taken off life support. And due to COVID and situation, his family was not actually allowed to be with him when that took place. That's a very, very close situation that hits home, and a lot of people are dealing with that, just like we did 2 days ago. You're going to want to click on that link. And unfortunately, criminals don't care, how this affects you. They don't know you. They don't care to know you. And that's what's going on. So what we have to assume, right, is that credentials have been leaked. We have to understand that with this many breaches taking place, that more than likely your credentials that you use day to day have already been dumped to the internet or to the dark web somewhere. We have to start creating visibility around these breaches happening. And when visibility is available, we have to use it. Because as we move from on-premise to cloud solutions, our network teams, our security people lose that critical visibility, because the things that we were looking at internally are now pushed up into Office 365, Dropbox, and all these other solutions. So here's how to protect yourself, right? I promised I was going to show bad things, but I'm going to give you a way to help yourself so that you don't have to be vulnerable to these things. You need to use two-factor authentication for everything you possibly can. And if possible, there's some FIDO solutions out there where you can use a biometric reader that will go ahead and do that authentication. But if you know that the majority of your credentials have probably been leaked, then the only way to prevent those credentials from being used is to have a second form of authentication. There are solutions that are text-based. There's things like Duo, which are for free. You can use them to do that second factor of authentication, which means if I had your credentials and tried to use them, I would still have to have your phone. I would have to have some sort of verification of who you are to use those credentials. And again, this is free. You don't have to pay to use Duo for a personal account. You can also reduce the attack surface, right? So if you're doing, constant, up-to-date patching, if you're on a Windows platform, make sure you have those patches that are going to be updated and applied, on that schedule, so you don't have to remember to do it. Almost every breach that we conduct, being paid to do so, is either going to be a credentials or it's going to be on unpatched systems. And patches for Windows are free. You just have to keep the Windows up to date. Another thing I remind people is that you don't have to protect what you don't have. If there isn't utility for the data that you're holding on to that might be 20, 25 years old, or maybe it's a shorter window and it's 10 years old. If you don't have a business utility for it, then you do not need to keep that online. That way, if you have a breach and you've put these things in buckets and you've secured them and you've offlined data that you don't need, you don't have to worry about that data being included in a breach. So, you don't have to protect what you don't have. And then understanding, again, I'm going to beat this horse nearly to death and probably back to life before we get to the other end of this talk. But data lives everywhere. It's not just on your file server at the office anymore. So let's look at what configuration mistakes look like when you try to take a company that is only ready for a few percent of its staff to go work from home to now being 97% of their staff working from home. We worked a case where we had threat actors that broke into a network due to an unpatched Windows 2012 server. When they broke in, they took a ton of data and they dumped it all to Pastebin. which those that don't know what Pastebin, it's a site where you can just go anonymously paste information that you find that you don't want to be tied to. And as we went and started looking through this data, we found a ton of super sensitive information. But this is how it happened. There was a Windows 2012 server. It was connected to the internet. It had not been patched in 2 years. They had this disclaimer right at the top, this warning that you're not supposed to use this system unless you were given permission authorized by management, and you had to be part of the future finance group. But the problem is you don't have to click that button. There's a vulnerability that's been around for over 2 years that will allow you to just bypass authentication entirely. This was a switch that's in a hospital that was connected directly to the internet, and you didn't have to use authentication. If you just knew the port that was answering on, you could directly connect to it. Again, when you go to turn all these things inside out and you don't reconsider what the attack scope is going to be and what your attack surface is going to be when you make these changes, things like this happen. So here is full control of a switch in a medical environment without any credentials. And this is where ransomware took a hard right-hand turn. I've been telling people for years that in order to encrypt something, you have to be able to read and write something. What that means is if there is data that is incredibly sensitive to you, in order to encrypt it, you have to be able to read it. And if you're going to do the encryption, you have to be able to write to it. What we've come to find out is what I had projected for the last few years, which was data was being pulled off-site so that a copy remained on a remote server after they encrypted the data in the ransomware. So that if you didn't pay the ransomware or that bounty, not only did you lose that data, but if you didn't pay it, they also started to auction off your data to the rest of the world. There have been some very tough cases and incident responses that we've had to work with in the past couple of years. And this year has been an all-time high. And what's happening now is they're taking it a little bit further. They're breaking the auction of the data off in pieces so that the impact to the organization lasts even longer. So you're not going to have sort of this one shot in the press and then you go recover. They're dragging this out for years. So here's how you prevent it, right? Leverage proper access control. If you don't need access to everything, don't have access to everything. I'm a founder of 2 companies, and they're both very successful companies, and they're doing very, very well. I don't have access to everything in the organization. It's not required for me to do my job. If I need a report, it can be pulled for me on my behalf. If I need data to be shared with me on a P&L, or if I need to look at KPIs, that information can be pulled for me. It's not that I don't need that data, it's that my account doesn't need access to that data. And if my accounts for some reason were breached, we can limit the impact of that breach because I don't have access to the things that I don't need to have access to. So keep your systems patched. Again, we covered this a minute ago. Apply the updates. Keep the Windows scheduled updates going. As much as we hate sitting there when we need to do something and wait for the Windows to apply the updates and apply all these things, it's better to go through that temporary moment of downtime than to go through the outcomes that we're seeing when you don't. Again, know where your sensitive data lives. Know what you need to protect. You probably don't have a budget that's going to protect everything. So you need to define what's the most important thing to protect and then act accordingly. And back up and restore the data. This seems so simple, but it's not. Companies are making a lot of changes right now, and they're going to keep making a lot of changes right now. What is often forgotten is to update the backup jobs. If you take all this data and you move it to another server because you need the resources to host a fully remote workforce, you have to update the backups. If you don't, that data won't be included. And if you have a failure, you have an issue, the data will not be there to recover. To me, backups are always more important than the original data because I can restore that backup as many times as I want. If that original data is lost and I don't have a backup, I'm done. So just kind of keep these things in mind. Forwarded emails, right? We talked about this a second ago. You don't have the ability to track it anymore. And if the emails or the correspondence turns into criminal action or a lawsuit or something that you have to defend as an organization, you don't have that complete chain of communication. So it's going to be much harder when you go to fight some of these battles, both legal and internal, if you don't have the information and you don't know what was said and you can't prove what was said. Also, users aren't aware of all the public email service breaches out there. Their credentials may have been breached and leaked for over a year, and they've not updated it. So when the email starts getting forwarded into those accounts, you have a real problem on your hands. Also, sometimes emails that employees will forward, they don't consider them as sensitive because they've been around it for 10 or 15 years. This may be incredibly sensitive information, but to them, it's just another thing that they're passing back and forth. So, you have to constantly remember that often we forget how important some of the data and some of the things we handle are. So, we also move into another unfortunate situation is there's a new liability that's introduced when organizational communications are tied to personal decisions. So, for instance, you may have an employee that outside of business hours leads a life or a lifestyle that is entirely counter to the mission of your organization. If you're Chick-fil-A, that's really important. That's an organization that is very, very tied and bound to the image that they put out from a moral and an ethical standpoint. But they don't discriminate on the employees that work there. So if something is breached or an employee goes to Twitter and posts something that's incredibly insensitive or racist, that now gets tied to the organization because of these different communication chains and the hours that people are working. You have to defend it. So here's what you can do to protect yourself. You need to know and get alerts when employees start forwarding emails, and you need to know that they start forwarding it the minute that happens. Most of us and most of the platforms that you're using, if you're using a cloud-based platform, will give you the ability to get an alert when they start doing that. They also need to provide, organizations need to build some technical controls that can prevent that forwarding from happening to begin with, so that business gets separated from personal and it stays that way. That way you have some administrative controls and you have some technical controls that are going to outline the expectation. It's also going to reduce your liability. So let's get into what a stolen identity looks like. And I know we love to throw that term around over the past few years of, someone got my credit card and they stole my identity. Well, they didn't. A stolen identity looks entirely different. As COVID-19 hit, we had a problem on our hands in the United States. There were more people passing away, and there were more government agencies that were closed. There were more hospitals that were completely buried in this situation to keep up with the amount of people that had passed away from it. There wasn't the ability to go through and document each and every person. There are still many, many records of people that have passed by COVID that have yet to be committed to government or public record. Unfortunately, here's what happens. Families go and post that a spouse or a loved one has passed. An obituary goes into the newspaper. What happens is that the criminal underground finds out that people are dying faster than the government agencies and the financial institutions are realizing that these people have passed. So the ability to go and prevent attacks from happening has gone away. What we're finding right now is that the identities of those that have passed from COVID are going for about $3 a record. And if you want records that haven't been sold to someone else, they're a little bit more. But if you're willing to buy a whole bunch of records and you're not worried if someone has already used that identity, you can get a bulk discount. This is what it looks like. This is an individual that we tracked and we pulled data and we turned it over to law enforcement. This individual decided to make a business out of going and stealing the identities of corona victims. He's paying people to go and gather the news and the clippings and to go on ancestry.com and other websites and collect all of the information supporting supporting information to go and change financial accounts. And so he's paying people by day to just go and get the information. And then if they'll send it to him, he will pay them for their time for doing it. And then he will commit the crime of going and performing true identity theft. So how this plays out is they go buy the identity, and then they go and take all of the death benefits. They take all of the banking accounts that they're able to get access to, and they're wiring that money out. And they're doing ACH transfers. They're contacting wealth advisors and TPAs that aren't doing proper due diligence and due care and confirming that someone is who they say they are when they call. And this is a huge business right now. So, let's get into the good side there. I don't want to leave on a negative note. We believe that based on the things that we're seeing right now from quantum computing, that it's possible that we will be facing far fewer and maybe the light of the last pandemics that we're going to see. As pandemics, they're applied to humans, and humans don't really evolve too much. If you go back to the earliest copies and the different illustrations from the Bible, we all had 5 fingers, 10 fingers and 10 toes, and we all had a head, and we mostly walked upright. There's not been a lot of change, to the biology of a human, but the innovations in quantum computing and superposition and the ability to apply that to models has changed things significantly on how we can go and find markers. In fact, we might be part of the first generation ever that's going to have a pandemic begin in the same calendar year that we find a vaccine for it. That hasn't been done before. So at least not by my knowledge and my research. So that's a very short timetable from pandemics that lasted years and decades to now we find out something in 2019 and we potentially have a vaccine going into production in 2020. That's a huge change. Supervised machine learning, it greatly reduces some of the phishing attacks we're seeing because the machine learning can look at ways that you typically reply to emails. It can look at how you typically phrase things and maybe even the time in which you respond and say something. By having machine modeling to look at your mannerisms and your communications, it can spot outliers. It can help us spot things that would be a threat actor that's compromised a machine or an account. Behavioral detection data modeling is becoming far more accurate. The amount of false positives that we see internally with our platform is greatly reduced to what we had 3 or 4 years ago because the models aren't overfit or underfed. They're getting far closer to being true and locked in. Something really interesting that I didn't see coming at the beginning of 2020 is that I've been involved in the hacking community for, I don't know anymore. I think officially I got involved in 93, 94. So we're talking about 27, 28 years. I've never seen the collaboration that I've seen among hackers in the community trying to stop cyber criminals. And kind of keeping in mind, right? There's good hackers and there's bad hackers. There's criminals, and then there are those that are trying to do good, like me. and it looks like that collaboration is going to continue far after 2020. So I'm excited to see where most of the collaboration in my first 10, 15 years in a scene was very much disruptive, going and taking down networks and, defacing websites and that sort of thing. To now there's a huge collaboration to go and prevent these things from happening and prevent the impact on healthcare. So I'm pretty excited about what's going on down the road. But I wanted to take some time, to answer questions because I just threw a whole lot of information, out there on the table.